Well, good morning, everyone. I want to thank Peter Adler for that introduction to GALDEF, because he's laid the groundwork for the next step, which is GALDEF. And I want to begin by saying that I really appreciate the sponsorship that I received from Attorneys for the Rights of the Child and from Steve Scott for helping make it possible for me to be here to make this presentation. GALDEF is just shorthand for Genital Autonomy, Legal Defense, and Education Fund. And you might be wondering, what is Legal Defense and Education Fund? Well, in the history of at least progressive civil and human rights in the US, LDEFs have been instrumental in advancing legal recognition of the rights of vulnerable groups of people in our society, namely women, racial minorities, LGBTQI people. And examples of LDEFs include Lambda Legal, which I'm going to talk about in a second here, Gay and Lesbian Advocates and Defenders, and NAACP, and the National Organization for Women. LDEFs quite often raise money to initiate impact litigation, and that results oftentimes in progress in the courts for securing the rights of these individuals. Lambda Legal is the one organization that I'm most familiar with. Lambda Legal has been in existence for 50 years. And as a young gay man, I was a member of Lambda Legal and very supportive of their efforts. They have been responsible for every major legal advancement affecting LGBTQI people in the past 50 years, including a court case in '96 that guaranteed the right of openly gay and lesbian people to serve in the US military. The Lawrence v. Texas landmark decision back in 2003, in which, for those of you who are not familiar with state sodomy laws, these were laws on the books. Some of them are still on the books, but they're not enforced any longer. But they were enforced primarily against gay men. And these were laws that basically said that the state had a right to regulate private adult consensual behavior. And the Lawrence v. Texas decision rendered by the Supreme Court struck down state sodomy laws. The most recent example of Lambda's work is Obergefell v. Hodges, which many of you are aware was the Supreme Court decision that basically guaranteed same-sex couples the right to marriage equality. Lambda recently began a podcast series, and my ears pricked up when they sent me a link to this teaser podcast, and I thought, wow, this is really applicable to the genital autonomy issue. And I'd like to play an excerpt for you here. And I'd like you to pay close attention to the bolded, underscored words in this presentation, because I believe it really speaks to our movement. Well, now how do we back out of this? Hang on. Went to the wrong slide.
A journalist and host, and I cover all things LGBTQ+ and the issues that affect our community. I'm thrilled to share the launch of a new podcast series from Lambda Legal called Making the Case. On this podcast, we'll be pulling back the curtain on Lambda Legal's influential casework. On each episode, I'll sit down with a lawyer or two to discuss how they successfully litigated some of the most consequential lawsuits impacting LGBTQ+ and HIV civil rights. It's the biggest legal victory for people living with HIV in decades. We're getting into all of it. We'll talk about the creative strategies Lambda lawyers use to set up and win their cases.
There are many types of medical care where some religions oppose that care, and there's not endless religious rights to deny a person the medical standard of care.
We'll talk about unique challenges and issues that add to the process.
At that time, public opinion didn't necessarily favor same-sex couples being able to marry. We knew that we were
past 50 years.
We can have the best legal arguments in the world, and if we're not doing the work outside of the courtroom so that people can be receptive, because as I always say, judges are people too, we need to create those conditions in which people can rethink things that they thought that they always knew.
So pay close attention to those bolded statements because I'm going to be referring back to these during the presentation. But first, I want to get back to GALDEF and let you know about our vision and our mission. Our vision is, of course, a world where the rights of children to bodily integrity and future autonomy over their genitals and their sexuality are respected and legally protected. And I always like to condense it down into shorthand into who decides how much of a child's genitals they get to keep. Our mission is threefold. The first is to educate those in the legal community by drawing on the experience of people like David Llewellyn, Peter Adler, and others to help spread the word and help train a new generation of legal professionals to litigate these issues. The second is to support impact litigation, and that can be done through many ways, but one way that I think GALDEF can really do this is to help support financially, and that could be helping with filing fees, the retainer fees that might be involved, discovery expenses, helping with the cost of getting expert witnesses for cases and so forth. We also might be able to help with indemnifying lawyers who are willing and courageous to take on impact litigation, but of course are always concerned they're going to lose money, especially if they get slapped with a judgment of frivolous lawsuits. And the third part of our mission is to raise the funds to make this possible. Basically build up a war chest. And this is not something that's going to happen overnight or in a year. It's a years-long process to build up the money so that we're well prepared when the right cases come before us, or we seek out and create the right cases to make it happen and to make an impact. And our motto is affirming rights, protecting choice, and redressing harm. So you might be wondering, who do we serve? Well, basically, it's children at risk of genital cutting and those affected by the cutting, and I've condensed that into an acronym, CARTAC. We are the CARTAC community, in a sense. We are building community here. And who that might entail specifically would be parents who are involved in insufficient consent or no consent, especially immigrant parents who are not proficient in the English language, who are giving birth in hospitals and handed consent forms that they don't understand, and they sign off on it, and their rights have been abused through that process. We could be helping parents who are victimized by the circumcision marketing campaigns that Intact America has been very good at exposing. We could be helping plaintiffs, young men in the 18 to 20 age range where they've reached the legal age of majority and they're now able to bring a lawsuit for harm they suffered during their childhood. We could be also helping circumcision sufferers to seek restitution, particularly for their financial costs of medical or mental health care, for the damage they've undergone, for foreskin restoration, people who want to recover the expenses involved. This will be particularly important if and when 4Gen creates regenerative medicine to restore the foreskin. And Tony Los Cuadro and I have been bouncing back and forth about the idea of creating state-based victim compensation funds. So that's another thing we can talk about later if you're interested. A very unique approach that occurred to me coming out of left field would be to find a transgender woman who was assigned male at birth, was subjected to penile circumcision, later discovered that she considers her gender identity to be female, and then seeks gender affirming care, particularly what's called bottom surgery, and then learns, gee, you know, if you had had that 15 square inches of erogenous tissue, we could have created a deeper neovagina for you and a better surgical result. We could be assisting taxpayers who are challenging Medicaid funding of newborn circumcision. Employees, for the pioneers in this movement, we know that certain employees in healthcare and education have been harassed or discriminated against or terminated from employment for speaking out for children's genital autonomy. And finally, but not exclusively, we could be helping whistleblowers who decide to expose the systemic fraudulent diagnoses that are being used by physicians and hospitals who bill health insurers for non-existent problems or resorting to circumcision over less radical alternatives. We do subscribe to a certain set of values within GALDEF, and those are namely that we promote solidarity with our allies who are fighting female and intersex genital cutting. We recognize that diversity and inclusivity are strengths, not only for the organization, but I believe also for our movement. We're committed to promoting equality for people regardless of who they are. We have zero tolerance for any prejudicial or divisive speech or deeds. And along with that, GALDEF has endorsed the statement opposing anti-Semitism within the genital autonomy movement. So the question is, who are we? Well, we're a bunch of white dudes. So this is our board. And the top row here is, of course, myself as founder and president, Matt Goodwin, who's giving a presentation virtually here today. He's our vice president. John Adkison is our treasurer. And of course, many of you know Andrew Little here. He's our wonderful secretary. On the bottom row, we have David Viviano, a longtime intactivist, Dan McClymont, who is here also from GALDEF, Ryan Jones, who's active in 4Gen. He's our kind of research go-to guy, and David Belashinsky. So although we look on the surface pretty homogenous, we have a number of us who identify as gay. David Belashinsky is Jewish. And we are committed to making GALDEF a much more diverse organization. We have invited some people of color and women, and we want more people from cutting communities, Jews, Muslims, Filipinos, Koreans, to join and make our organization much more representative. We're very fortunate to have some very good attorney endorsements here. Obviously, Stephen Svoboda has offered this wonderful endorsement of GALDEF. Peter Adler has endorsed the concept, and David Llewellyn has said, I think this is a great idea. We have needed such a fund for a long time. It would be wonderful to have a fund to support such litigation. Now, I want to veer off in a different direction and talk about our movement as a political issue. Back in 1995 and 1996, when I created Whose Body, Whose Rights, this was the, thank you, Stephen. This was the first video documentary that approached circumcision from a different point of view other than here's a 5 or 10 minute video to Mr. and Mrs. Jones of, oh, you're having a baby boy, you've got this important decision to make, here are the pros and cons, now it's up to you. This, for anybody who's seen the video, was a compendium of all the issues, the history, the foreskin restoration movement, men talking about their harm. And I'm very proud to say it's the only video that I'm aware of that highlighted a Brit Shalom ceremony in part 2 of the documentary. So this video, earlier this year, was inducted into the American Archive of Public Broadcasting because this video was broadcast initially on a number of PBS stations across the country, primarily KQED in San Francisco. They aired it twice, and they were kind enough to send me logs of people who called in about the program and sent me all the letters that people sent into them. And the response was overwhelmingly positive for the documentary. But I want to call your attention to this one letter that I received, and it's just priceless because it is so prescient. This writer said, after watching your program on circumcision, I could not help but wonder whose and what the hidden agenda was. The stridency of the telecast was, to me, overwhelming, and if extrapolated, leads to the same kind of thinking of the abortion foes. Can you imagine this becoming a political issue? Well, folks, it already is. When you got people like Andrew Yang, presidential candidate, coming out and saying he's against circumcision, we've arrived. So I want to share some good news. I want to share some bad news, in my opinion. The good news is our message is spreading. It doesn't matter what kind of body you were born into, a female body, a male body, an intersex body. We have different bodies, but we share the same rights in common. And that message is getting out to the wider society. And people are realizing that forced non-therapeutic genital cutting is a human rights issue. And our movement is coming out of the fringe and out of the shadows from the 1970s and 80s to a point where it's gaining respect and our message is reaching the mainstream. And those public perceptions are going to be very important to help advance litigation. Remember what was said in that podcast, judges are people too. Now, I also have some bad news to share. Our message is spreading. And unfortunately, and this is just my opinion, our message of compassion and concern for human rights is being malappropriated to advance the politics of fear and hate. And our movement is at risk of being radicalized and relegated to be considered fringe again. Negative public perceptions about us and our messaging will hinder litigation efforts. Remember, we want to speak in a way and with our messaging so that people can be receptive, because judges are people too. So what do I mean by that? Here's an example. I believe there are certain forces in our society that are hijacking the genital autonomy message to feed their own hate-filled agendas. And one example of this is the CEO of Gab, which many of you know is a social media platform. And Andrew Torba is the CEO of that social media platform. And when the Roe v. Wade decision was reversed by the Supreme Court, he was quoted as saying, "Say goodbye to your abortions, whores." And then he followed that up with a very threatening message. He said, "The Christian takeover of our Christian country has begun." And I believe him when he says that, because I believe, this is my personal opinion, that Christian nationalism is on the rise in this country, and it is a threat to everyone here, not just a gay person like me, not just to our Jewish friends, but to people of color and anybody who doesn't fit their narrow definition of what is an American. And then he went on to make this statement, because he's noted for his anti-Semitism. He said, next, we need to ban the barbaric act of circumcision, which is also a Jewish sacrament that was imposed on our men outside of their will as mere babies. So I think we need to stay on guard against this kind of thing. And there's another example that I want to bring to your attention. There is in my opinion, I'm not really active on social media, but the best people tell me that there is a trend to use the word pedophilia to describe circumcision and circumcisers. And this, for those of you who are not familiar, has historically been used by reactionary groups in our society to objectify other people as being dangerous to children. I know personally, as a young gay man growing up, that's all I heard, that I was going to be a pedophile. It's been used against Jews historically. It's been used against atheists. And now what I'm hearing is these forces are using it to use against political opponents. It's being used against librarians who want to be inclusive with LGBTQ materials in public libraries. It's being used against school boards, city councils, the Democratic Party. This is not necessary. It's not helpful for us to use this. And our allies against female and intersex genital cutting don't have to resort to using this term. So my message is keep it simple and keep it clear, so that people can be receptive, because judges are people too. So in my opinion, the systemic problem with forced non-therapeutic genital cutting is not pedophilia. It's what Travis Wisdom calls circumcisionism. And if you haven't read his 2 articles on the subject, I highly recommend that you do so. Travis defines circumcisionism as the hegemonic view that genital circumcision is a normative and acceptable practice. That is what we need to keep our eyes on the ball for, not get sidetracked into new definitions of what pedophilia is. So, more good news, an encouragement from Professor Lawrence Tribe. For those of you who aren't aware, he's a very famous, very well-respected constitutional law professor from Harvard University. And back in April, on a whim, I looked him up on the internet and there's his email address. So I took the chance and sent him an email, and I told him who I was and what I'm trying to do. And I asked him a question. I said, do you think this would be a good idea to try to challenge the anti-FGM statute on the federal level for a violation of the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause? And the next day he writes back, "Hi, Tim," as if he's known me for ages, and very lengthy response. And I just want to read a few things to you very quickly. He basically said that he didn't believe courts would be willing to wade into this issue because they're very, very wary of treading on legislative turf by criminalizing conduct that the legislature didn't opt to outlaw from the start. But he agrees that this gender-based protection under federal statute creates an inequitable and unsustainable legal situation. And then he goes on to say, as someone who is offended by that line on moral and philosophical grounds, and as someone whose life work has been wrapped up with matters of equal liberty and dignity, and who has devoted years to the LGBTQ cause, I'd eagerly take up the cudgels on your behalf if I thought the time was right to launch this kind of judicial challenge. But what he did offer was this kernel of wisdom. He says, the expansion of rights is not the exclusive province of the federal judiciary, hard word to say. He recommended that a lot of social change in the US percolates from the bottom up, and he recommended to start at the state level and challenge state constitutions. And I won't say it now, but maybe we have time for Q&A. I want to talk about the Equal Rights Amendment. So he suggested we start there, but he did say that we could help persuade the courts and we could help persuade legislatures, but it has to be accompanied by a suitable consciousness-raising campaign. That's the kind of work that everybody here is doing, Intact America is doing, and all the organizations are doing this. More good news. Kevin Jennings is the CEO of Lambda Legal. And in March, he came to Palm Springs for a fundraiser. In one afternoon at a private home, Lambda Legal raised $100,000 to fight the new cases that are coming down the line, particularly on transgender, but also some anti-gay legislation and so forth. Anyway, he and I had coffee for about an hour, and I talked with him about this concept of GALDEF, and he sort of scrunched up his brow and he said, genital autonomy, why not just call it what it is, genital mutilation? So we know he's in our corner, and he gets it, that there's an intersectionality between the rights of LGBTQI people to control what's done to our bodies and what we do with our bodies, whom we love, who we marry, and the connection with children's rights to bodily autonomy. So one of my major projects, and along with GALDEF and our wonderful board, is to strengthen that relationship with Lambda Legal. So this is a plea for help. GALDEF needs more diversity in our board. We need people to join our legal and medical advisory councils because we are basically administrative staff, but we need the legal expertise and the medical expertise from people. And Taurus Bigner has just agreed to join us. And Travis Wisdom has agreed to be our intersex consultant. And a couple other people here too. We really need people to help us with fundraising. So we formed a subcommittee for that. And we need, well, we've already found somebody in Greg to help us maintain the website. We need graphic designers, we need a social media coordinator, and we need courageous attorneys. So I want to end by reading to you this quote from Hani Lightfoot Klein, who you know wrote the book Prisoners of Ritual about female circumcision. She was raised in a Jewish family. She included a chapter at the end about male circumcision. She views them as equal violations of children's rights to bodily integrity. And she said, you know, if this were easy, someone would have done it by now. And also Lawrence Tribe, who, when he was interviewed on MSNBC recently to talk about the Roe v. Wade decision, he didn't make this comment about our issue, but about Roe v. Wade. He is eternally optimistic. He says, for women's bodily autonomy rights, there is always a path forward. And I believe that about our issue too. So we are the Genital Autonomy Legal Defense and Education Fund. We're a 501c3. We're new, and we're the new baby on the block. We ask you to subscribe to our homepage for updates. You can donate through various means, PayPal, Amazon Smile, Cafe Press, and buy our merchandise. And you can also apply for the Charity Charge MasterCard, which gives 1% cashback rewards, and you can nominate or you can designate GALDEF to be your beneficiary for those rewards. So get the card, spend your life away, and it's a painless way to help GALDEF. So thank you for your attention. One more thing I forgot to mention. I'm really pleased to announce, I was just informed this weekend, that Doctors Opposing Circumcision has made a generous pledge of seed money to our organization.